Good morning to everyone here on Zoom and to everyone anywhere listening. We are happy to have you. And the point and purpose of our discussion is to deal in current events. So on the podcast, any of the discussions are pertinent because they're not dealing in time-based current events other than the current event of what's happening now. And this is just the latest discussion of that discussion developing with those who are directly involved in it as an opportunity to listen and hear what may not otherwise seem obvious, but I would suspect and suggest you already know. If there is any absolute basis to our existence, we absolutely know that basis and couldn't operate or exist if it weren't for that knowledge, that knowing, that awareness. So our discussion is experientially based. It's not a medical, scientific, or academic diagnosis, theory, or thesis. We're not for or against anything, but are here to discuss clearly, as clearly as we can, the underlying disease, disturbance, and discomfort caused by addictive, obsessive thoughts. And to anyone listening who's struggling or suffering from what seems out of control and can, to the sufferer, always seem to be happening to them, you are and cannot be alone regardless of your thoughts. There are many free 12-step programs for almost every obvious compulsion. And within those programs, there are many, many more people interested in helping and seeing people get better. And they will do for you what you cannot even imagine or might not be able to imagine anyone ever doing. And my experience is many of those people did for me things that no one close to me ever bothered to do. And part of the reason was they were starting to address a problem I had that I had overlooked, and as a result was overlooked by others, since my own defiance and denial and defensiveness kept me seemingly isolated so that I could continue to maintain the problem I thought was unique to me. Recovery from any compulsion is evidence that recovery from the core mental disease of addiction is also possible. And what's primary in your participation with any problem that you may have, we're not telling you you have one, we're not suggesting you have one, but if you do happen to have one as a result of this thinking problem, you know it, you're aware of it, you're aware of the consequences of it. And your participation ultimately is what makes the difference for anyone having anything valuable to offer you or helpful. Mentally obsessive thinking is focusing only on all the ways to refill a flat tire. Same kind of thinking. And this form of thought focuses on the problem and avoids the cause, which in a flat tire would be the leak. Anxiety, stress, abiding fear, and depression all leak or secrete through our pores in blood, sweat, and tears. And if we're focused on only trying to fix the consequence or symptom, we're ignoring the cause, and the trap of addiction is trying to feel better about what we know is wrong. That's how it's managed and maintained. Life is the basis of all possibility. Life is not impossible when we see things through the lens of obsessive thoughts. The impossibility we see is turning lies into truth. Our own attempt to think that because we can conclude something is true, it must be true, and we need to fight for it on our defensive about it in relation to it. And once lies are relied on, denial and defense maintain the delusion that truth will eventually be realized. Just never comes today. And it also presumes that the only truth is what I think. And that means everything relies on my thinking. And if my thinking is wrong, I have good reason to be full of doubt, fear, and anxiety. Since this line of thinking is backward, the lens of perception is backward. So we see everything as against us because we're trying to reverse the natural order of things. And we think we have in our own thinking. We think someday a lie will be true, and as a result, we see nature as something that is opposed to us. So everyone and everything appears to be an enemy, as though they're out to get us. Thinking about what is happening that isn't even happening is all that's happening, because all we're thinking about is what we're thinking. What we are really afraid of, once we think what we're thinking is true and real, is what we think. And thoughts that are not the same as ours seem to attack us and seem to put us at risk. And what other people think seem to be preeminent in the way we make decisions and go about our lives and choose our friends and maintain our relationships. It isn't true. It's a misperception. What we are afraid of is what we're thinking. And not about other people, places, and things, but as an accurate assessment of what is wrong with our own thinking. That's what we're afraid of. So the clarity of our awareness is actually built into the feelings we're having, and yet we react to them in exactly the opposite way that helps maintain and manage them, rather than actually resolve the core source of the problem by talking about the thinking we're doing rather than the things we're thinking about. So I could go on this, and I expect I'm going to develop some of these so there's less of a preamble in each one of the group discussions, and more opportunity to tune into segments of this insight, if it offers any, individually on the podcast, so that you can jump around and come to them at any point. We can get to the discussion a little bit quicker. So in the meantime, good morning, gentlemen. Welcome. So far, it's only gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Les, Alex.
Good morning. How are you?
So what's happening in the world you guys make up?
I took a vow too. I'm not going to talk. I'm going to be on mute 80% of the time. That's my stretch.
Who says I don't have control over others?
Yeah. I don't want to piss Les off.
Oh, you don't want to see that. It's a big character
Anthony,
defect of mine.
keep in mind, when anyone is telling you what you're doing wrong, they are admitting their own limits.
Exactly.
And that is, if any truth, if we're able to speak in any terms that are true, then it's true for all of us. And I'm not suggesting we're speaking in true terms. I'm suggesting that we're doing our best to look at things in terms that are accurate enough to rely on, not occasionally for one problem and not the other, but to look at the underlying issue of all the thinking we do when we make believe our thinking is true and correct, rather than simply thoughts that we concluded, decisions we made, conveniences of coming to a conclusion that we want to live with for a minute or a second. It does not mean we're condemned to those thoughts, ever. And yet obsessive thinking would tell us, because it's a disease, a dis-ease, a lack of ease caused by the instability of the thinking, that the only thing we have to do is the thing we've always done. So we keep redoing it, thinking someday it will get better, someday it will fix the problem, when in fact it is the cause of the problem. And I would say that's a pretty simple definition of addiction in all respects, compulsions included. Thinking that drinking more for the alcoholic is a solution is an interesting concept, when it's the drinking that's causing the problem as far as the compulsion goes. Obviously, the thinking is at the core of that drinking, and the thinking that more and more and more is never enough is because the actual thinking is not being treated accurately. It's being misdiagnosed based on trying to get away from the contempt and the anxiety and the depression and all of the feelings that are uncomfortable. So we run into compulsions and impulsive behaviors to try to feel better about what's wrong. And feeling better about what we're doing that's wrong in thinking is the trap of addiction. Trying to feel better gives us the momentary impression that we're controlling the problem, when in fact we're managing it. Management of it maintains it. And so it becomes a chronic loop if it isn't seen correctly. Just like trying to refill a tire with air constantly and never thinking about fixing the leak or changing the tire. Good morning, Everett. So we're not talking about fixing a leak or changing a tire here. We're actually talking about if truth is true and reality is real, then that is the absolute basis of our existence, regardless of what we think. It's just beginning to concede that if these principles of truth and reality underlie the nature of existence, then there's nothing we can do to change them, but many things we can do to give the appearance of controlling, denying, or being apart from them. When we become consumed with thinking we're alone becomes natural, because all we're doing is thinking about thoughts that are alone because they have no substance, they have no basis. So they have no place in reality and truth. They have only a place in thought. Lies only exist in our brains. There is no other place they reside, and they don't even reside in our brain except to a thought that they reside in our brain, just to show how flimsy they are.
I see how. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Everett.
Good morning, Everett.
It's. I can see where I desperately grasp onto those thoughts for an identity with myself, if that makes sense. This instead of just being.
Well, the self you're trying to grasp onto is based in those thoughts.
Yeah.
Ego is just what we think of ourselves. And when we think our thoughts are true and real, we naturally create a self, because thinking of itself creates a self born in thought. And that's all ego is. It doesn't mean we can't have images of ourselves or we can't think of ourselves in different ways. But again, when we think of those ways as truth and reality, we've now made a major leap into making believe that we are the creators of truth and reality rather than a product of truth and reality. And it's like the mariners of old looking at the horizon and thinking if they get near that edge, they're going to fall off because it looked like the edge of doom. And to a being that's absolute knowing sense or presence, thinking of an edge as real or true, like the limit of a thought, would be very scary to approach, because it would appear to be the end of everything rather than seen as the beginning of everything. Like the mariners, once they started approaching the horizon, they realized they could never even reach the horizon on a sphere. You can never even get to it. But you can get to the places hidden by it and begin to realize those places were always there, regardless of how they were seen from the point of view of someone not approaching that horizon, someone not traveling in that direction.
That's a great analogy.
Well, and it's really the same thing that kept humans from circumnavigating the globe is keeping humans from circumnavigating their own circuitous thinking and noticing the impact this has had on our civilization from the beginning, and cultures that are all developed around ideas that are trying to rationalize why people do strange things and come up with these things just saying, well, this is just the things we do. This is the type of people we are. When a lot of it is born on self-indignation that leads to the point of thinking the best thing we can do is kill other people to serve ourselves and save ourselves, when in fact, by doing that, we put the self we think we're saving at risk.
Would-
92% of human history there's been a war going on Earth.
Would you say we're spirits trapped in thought?
We're what?
Spirits trapped in thought?
No, we can't be trapped in thought, but we're thinkers trapped in thinking. That's all. Thinking something we do, it's not something we are. So a spirit couldn't be trapped in something that it does. Like I can't be trapped in my foot by walking, but I can rely on my foot to be there when I walk. I can't be trapped in my arm if I decide to flap my arm. I'm not trapped. It's a choice I make to have it do that thing. So the mistaken identity is making believe that who we become is what we think. And all of a sudden we think the trap we've created is who we are, and we're actually trapped, when all we've done is conveniently created a trap in thought to justify that we're victims and irresponsible and somehow condemned to our existence. And the irony of that argument is we're really making a case, it's a death wish, to claim that we don't exist, which I would say is a good indication of why addiction and suicide is so popular. It's an attempt to kill the self we think we are because we don't seem to know how to stop it, because we don't talk about what we're actually doing honestly in thought. We haven't explored the inner reset. We think of the ocean as the most unexplored body in the world, body of nature, but it's our own thinking that has been unexplored in that regard and looked at in the simplest, accurate terms. And my sense is Buddha talked about life as suffering. He didn't talk about life as suffering. He talked about attachment to desire as the cause of suffering. So what was that? An addiction. Once we get started thinking the thing that's going to make us feel better is the thing that will make us feel better, and never question what is it that keeps us feeling worse to always want to feel better, we end up doing that thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, thinking we'll get better, continuing to do it. And I think his addiction was fruit.
Well, the sugar. And sugar is a serious addiction.
Exactly. And fruit was a big, popular, form of eating back then because it was sweet and luscious and there's nothing wrong with it. But if it's all you do, just like today, we weren't designed not to eat sugar, but we were not designed to eat sugar that's been concentrated to the point that it's so strong and so potent and powerful that our body doesn't know what to do with it. And think of drugs, cocaine. If you chew on a tea leaf, it's stimulant, just like tea would be. But when you reduce it to the absolute most toxic chemicals to create just the magnified impact of its greatest sensory potential, just like heroin and opium and all those things are reductions. They're not, you could eat a poppy and probably not get very high, but if you start to reduce it down to its most caustic, toxic elements to become intoxicated by those things, it has an unintended consequence, but it's all derived by human effort. Cocaine doesn't reduce itself to what becomes difficult to digest, and alcohol doesn't form itself, even though certainly sugar and things can ferment and develop that compound, but it isn't as intentional as what humans do. So we've been intoxicated with our ability to distract our attention by feeling better about things that are wrong. And if we just simply look at what's wrong, my sense is our body is a chemical factory and it will start producing the chemicals it's designed to produce to give us a sense of well-being as a result of us acting well enough based on our being well.
I've got a question for you, Jack.
Uh-oh.
All right.
You're smiling. I like that.
So, if God is everything and God is nothing, either God is everything or God is nothing. And I would say, at least the God I've chosen to believe in is the personification of perfection and with the universe and loving. And so if God, everything that God makes or creates, in my view, is perfect, then God didn't make a mistake with us either. So why then do we have these struggles, in your view?
Do you want an answer?
Yeah.
We choose them.
And that's our freedom?
We're free to choose them, yes. But if, the definition typically, good morning, Ty.
Morning.
Good morning, LA. The definition typically of God very often is a God made in human's image. And when we think of God creating things, we think of God still making things up. But an infinite source doesn't make things up. An infinite source is everything to begin with that never had a beginning or an end. It's something that's completely beyond the construct of thinking about things being made up. We're the makers up of things. We're the ones that make things up. We're the ones that make the problems and then blame God, thinking it's imperfect. But if you compare something to itself, it's perfect. If you take a car that's been crushed by one of those machines that will never be the car it once was, chances are, and think of it in relationship to what it was rather than what it is, it seems imperfect. It's dented, it's broken, it's less than, it's not something that is reliable. But if you simply allow it to be what it is, because I will suggest it is what it is, regardless of what we're thinking, it's perfect. It's exactly as it is. And the difference between beginning to actually concede that we have always been present, that we are always not only where we are, but where we belong, because we can't long for any other place and be there. So we must be where we belong, and we must, as a result of everything being where we are now, have everything that there is. It may not mean it's in reach. It may not mean we can eat it. It may not mean we can utilize it, but it means we're connected to it and it's all here. And if we're not willing to concede that point, we're never going to find it anywhere else we ever look, ever. And what we're going to do is rationalize the disgusting nature of our existence by blaming a power that we call God, which we've now renamed to basically represent ego. We're blaming ego for the things we do wrong. We blame ego for not being able to get better. We blame ego for our thoughts and the things we do that are outrageous and less, that we know are wrong, as though ego has power other than what we think of it. And it's the same with this idea of God. If the idea we have of God is that God is functioning as a human and God should be doing everything we like and want in the world, then we're not thinking of God at all. We're thinking about an image and likeness of humans and using it to excuse our own inability to reckon with the fact that we are doing the things we don't like. And we are thinking, and not only thinking, but feeding into the system that thinks that pollution and corruption and deception and cunning are all valuable traits, when in fact they're corrosive and undermine virtue and morals and principles.
What do you think we are?
What's that?
What do you think we are?
Absolute and in perfect order and naturally knowing and part of that. What would an infinite source give? If it had anything to give, what would it give if it was infinite?
Everything.
Yeah. And even everything, when you talk about everything and nothing, you notice that both of those things have thing at the end of them. Everything and no have thing. So the nothing is beginning to realize that if there is that supreme form of present knowing, it's both all the things we see and all the things we don't see. And what's interesting about that is that physicists are beginning to realize what they're calling dark matter is space, and they're calling it dark because it's invisible, not because it's black. And it means that all the space has more matter in it than all the matter we've been thinking was all that mattered. And it's a very interesting indication how our thinking has been bent on denying reality by making believe it's the source of reality and the source of truth. And as we peer into that nothingness, all of a sudden they begin to realize there's more there than not only we ever imagined, but more than everything we've ever imagined. And yet it's invisible. What does that tell me? If we are a part of that, we simply are relying solely on our five senses to tell us what's true and real, and forgetting that we have much greater sense of awareness than that. And physicists, again, have identified 11 or 12 different senses that we have in our bodies. That doesn't mean that's all of the ones that are out there. It means that that's what they've identified so far. Just like they've identified different dimensions of reality, or are at least considering different dimensions of reality that seem invisible to us. And yet, if they're happening, it doesn't matter whether we see them or think of them, they're happening. They are as they are, not as we think they are, until we begin allowing our thinking to say, oh, well, if they are as they are, I can live with that. I can allow that. I can allow that to be the basis of my thinking and the basis of my existence, and I can allow that I'm a part of that and cannot be apart from it. I can't be apart from something I'm a part of. On Earth, we join groups and can be separated from them, but we're never separate from the people that are parts of those groups. We're intimately connected. And to look at that nothing again, Everett, what's interesting in Deepak talks about this. What's interesting in the makeup of an atom is that the protons and neutrons and electrons are 99.99999% space and 0.00001% matter. And in that 0.0001% matter, it's 99.999% space and 0.000. So there's almost nothing in the universe that matters. And think of what people kill themselves over, what they think matters. What do they kill other people over? What they think matters, what they do in their own brain, what we choose to do in our own thinking. But we choose to think other people are offensive because they don't like our ideas or don't think like our ideas. That's a pretty thin veil to use to justify killing something as intricately designed as our bodies to solve the problem. And humans have done this from the beginning of recorded history. And it's still thought to be the solution. Someday we'll get it right. We haven't yet. I expect we won't on the path we've taken.
Are you kind of referencing what happened to the former Japanese prime minister?
Good morning, Nick. No, I wasn't specifically, but I'm referencing every one of those instances, including my own reaction to other. You may have some background noise there, Nick. Including my own reaction to other people based on what I think is right and what I think is real and what I think is true, rather than what they actually are in the same knowing present sense that we all are. So in those same reactive contemptful ideas I have, isn't it interesting how clear we can be about how wrong other people are, while in fact we're suffering with doubt and self-imagined insecurities and self-motivated fears. And yet we seem to have this perfect clarity about what my suspicion is, what we're seeing in others, and what others offer us is a clear view of what we're not willing to see in ourselves. And there to the nothingness, Everett, is the immediacy of being able to recognize that what I'm unable to see in my own thinking, I immediately see in what I think everything else is. So there's the absolute revealing itself.
Say that again. Say it again.
What I'm unwilling to see that I'm doing, I end up seeing in everything around me, which is my confirmation that the absolute is absolutely always absolute and complete and whole. I'm never making a separate argument for my own case, except to the argument I'm making about my own case. And the case I have needs a caseworker to manage the self it thinks it is. It's just thinking.
Describing the ego, Jack, taking credit, wanting to take credit for all the things that are good in our life. And a couple of moments you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, that we blame our ego, and I think that's true at times. But I think the ego, or the inner critic, really is kind of the more deceptive part of us that oftentimes blames God, higher power,
it's trying to be God.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it wants to deceive us into thinking like that our thinking is the end all and be all, and disconnect us from not only the spirit but even our body. That's what you were talking about earlier. When we're stuck in that thinking loop, we're not aware of our body. We're not aware of the moment that we're living in. We're living in either the past or the future.
Well, I would suggest that we are aware, and it's our rush to make believe we're in the past or the future, which can't be possible, since the past and future is only ever considered in the present. But it's in the rush of judgment that we're in control of reality and truth by imagining things that aren't true to be real and true.
Right. The ego is rushing us to make that decision because then it stays alive.
But think of the ego, yes. Which I think what you're saying, Alex, is that the reliance of ego is based on fear because we know it doesn't exist and it's all born in what we create in our thinking. It's not born in anything. It doesn't exist, like a lie doesn't exist outside of my own thoughts. And a lie, given that it has no other basis than my thinking, requires obsessive thinking. So when I'm consumed with the thinking, I begin to think that the ego has a life of its own rather than see it as a byproduct of my imagination that I'm using to justify I'm not doing what I'm doing to give it a life of its own or give it the impression. And then all of a sudden, God becomes a reflection of ego because all I think God of is this imaginary sense of self that becomes so iconic and real that I've actually imbued ego with life. And now I am the creator of life. So I am God. And the ego,
Right.
I imagine, is, and it just feeds on
Well, the
itself.
ego is just a part of us, right?
What's
Just
that?
Like we have the ego is just a part of us.
Well,
Like
it's,
we have many parts of ourselves.
yeah, your
you say
microphone's
that?
a little muddy, Alex.
Oh,
Are you
okay.
speaking into it?
I have headphones on, so maybe it's that. Let me do something different.
Pull it either a little closer or a little further.
Okay.
If it's all made up, it has no reality. And the trigger is thinking thoughts can be real and true rather than recognize thoughts are thoughts and they're essentially imagined. And we're capable of imagining that they're real and true, but we're also capable of thinking who we are is what we think. And it doesn't mean that it's real and true. It just means it's a capacity of thought. We have this extraordinary ability to create a maze that seems to be impossible to get out of because we forget that we're the makers of it. You can't make it and not know how to get out of it. Couldn't possibly be the maker of it unless you're deceptive in the thinking you're doing. And so it's a convenience of thought to imagine that the ego is something happening to us rather than something caused by us. And talking about it really begins to take apart some of the common narratives that are developed, which are all stories to justify. Stories are either moral or they're immoral. They're either justifying what we're doing or they're being used. Justifying what they're doing is an excuse for us not wanting to admit where we are is where we are, because what we're seeing and thinking is what we're doing with our thinking, and how we're seeing things is the perception we're creating by the thoughts we have. Rather than say, I can make up anything I want. And when I do, if what I'm making up is horrifying, I'm probably going to feel fearful and anxious and stress. Rather than thinking of those things as things happening to me, I can begin to notice that if I'm creating them, once I start seeing that, it becomes easy to say, I have no obligation to continue. If I'm making them up and can choose that, if I can choose horror, certainly I cannot choose horror.
Mm-hmm.
And the freedom of choice is recognizing that choice always allows not to be chosen.
Mm-hmm. I've been exercising that. Like I'll be imagining, for some reason, I'll imagine a scenario. My default is always absolutely disastrous and brutal. And I've actually lately said to myself, whoa, pump the brakes here, cowboy. Hey, now let's do that same scenario in the most abundant and positive way possible. If you can imagine that other dark, like horrible scenario, you can imagine the other. I've tried to work on that.
Well, I'll give you another angle on that. And then, Alex, I want to get back to the ego with you. Another angle on that is that the horror you're seeing is the accurate assessment of the thinking you're doing. So rather than try to stop it, just say, wow, I'm really capable of creating an environment that seems horrifying. And it has nothing to do with anything other than what I'm thinking. My experience is that I never let go of anything until I embraced it and had it as it was. And one of the tendencies of addiction is constantly trying to get away from the thing by thinking better about it, which means I'm feeling better about it, but never simply conceding that the bad I was feeling was simply coming from it and starting to say, oh, that's as much a possibility right now as this other thing. And if I see both opposites of being the same thing, which is choice, then the question is, do I want to continue to choose the thing that's horrifying me? And most, I would suggest, getting to your nothing and everything, Everett, most of what we're struggling with are things that we don't think we're doing. And as a result, we think they're happening to us. And instead of just simply conceding that the disruption, if we're experiencing it and it's primary and it seems to affect everything we see, like the problems we imagine to be so doomed, where all we can think of is the doom, and not notice that it's the doom of the thinking we're doing about that thing that's causing that sense of that thing to become so complex. We're trying to blame the problem for our feelings rather than the feelings we're having for the problem, and start to concede it. The other thing in your description, Everett, is that opposites, because if we're in an absolute state of being and knowingness and awareness, the opposite of that is the same. The opposite of the infinite is infinite. It isn't.
There's no
not
polar,
infinite.
right?
What's
There's
that?
no polarity to it. There's no
polarity.
All or nothing.
Yes.
A spectrum or continuum or is.
There's no polarity, right?
Right.
And Alex, you're in the mental health field, right?
Yep.
So you're familiar with the terms. All right. Think of polarity now. Bipolar, manic depressive. Those are all opposite positions. I'm either manic or I'm depressive. I'm never in the middle. Those
Someone
are all
say my name.
Those are all positions. Yes. Those are all positions taken, extreme positions taken in relation, as though that extreme position is real and true when the other one isn't. So what do I try to do in those roles? I try to escape being manic, so I become depressive. Then I try to escape being depressive and I become manic. And I escape being, and I just go on and on and on, because I think there's a way out, when in fact the totality of both of those extremes are absolutely united by the common ground between them. So bipolar, think of name some of the disorders.
Well, and you're right. Bipolar is one example, especially it has it in the name, but in mental health profession, we look at these things on a spectrum. We look at mood on a spectrum. So we do have the capacity, the human capacity to go from, mania to depression.
Yes.
But people vacillate along that spectrum.
Yes.
Throughout, whatever their day, their life.
But they're getting stuck in the loop of one or the other.
And the ego wants to convince us again, or our thought process pushes us to one polarity versus another.
Yes. Trying to escape one, you end up at the other. Trying to escape the other, you end up at the one. Trying to escape one, it just vacillates back and forth.
Well, and it's no surprise that our politics do the same. It's a reflection of us just as well.
Yes.
Ooh,
it just goes from one extreme to the other.
And then there's the horseshoe theory, where the farther you go in either direction of the political spectrum, you end up meeting in the middle. Well, not meeting in the middle, but actually the two extremes, the views in how radical they are both radical.
So sticking with what we do individually that actually creates that phenomenon in the world socially is making believe that somehow it's one or the other and isn't both. And to your earlier point, nothing and everything is the beginning of conceding that nothing and everything is the same thing. Nothing actually contains everything. And if it weren't for nothing, there would be no everything to be.
Infinitely.
The other thing, to Alex's point of shifting back and forth, is that there's always a balance in the dead center that you're talking about, Everett, in two extremes. There's always a balancing point, always. And if you move the center, if one outweighs the other, if you move the center, you can balance it. But it's a constant job to try to balance something and not notice that for something to be out of balance, it has to be based on something in balance. Let's say a teeter-totter. Mm-hmm. Teeter-totter is based on the solidity of the earth. And what's teetering and tottering is the plank that has a center point.
On the vortex.
I think they call it the fulcrum.
Fulcrum.
That center point. Yeah. And if, let's say you put a foot of it on, let's say you put the center point where a foot is and left 9 feet of the bench at the other end, you could put enough weight on the one end to balance it. You could do enough work. You could run harder, lose weight, get another relationship, get a new car, do all the stuff that would seem to fix it, and end up having the same problem because now you got to maintain the imbalance because you've never looked at the imbalance as being the issue. And the fact is, imbalance only occurs or only becomes obvious based on a natural state of balance. It wouldn't occur to us that it was out of balance if it was natural. It only occurs to us because it's unnatural and something we're doing and causing that we're unwilling to reckon with and see. And we even, Alex, as you're talking about, and I did for so many years, talk about the ego as though it has a life of its own. And if it's a constructive thought, when I begin to believe that my thoughts are real and true, I begin to think who I am as my thoughts. And that's ego. That's a self-induced state of a concept that I'm using to excuse and be irresponsible for the fact that I've created that thing I call ego, and now I'm using it to blame, just like I blame God for not. Why does God allow these things to happen? When in fact, I am a part of the society that isn't addressing them openly. And when I'm quiet, I am complicit in any of those things happening that I would think, why would God allow this? Nick.
Yeah, what if your thoughts tell you I'm hungry, I'm thirsty?
I would eat and drink water.
And so Nick just brought up exactly what I was about to ask you. Jack.
I'm not my thoughts, but I am hungry.
So,
you know what I mean?
Well, but again, think of what the thoughts are telling you, Nick. Yeah. Your body needs something. They're telling you if you denied those thoughts, you would go hungry and be dehydrated.
So we talk a lot about unhealthy thoughts.
Yes.
But there are thoughts like what Nick just brought up that are honest and accurate.
Yes.
How can we define which one is which, and would it make sense to maybe label them like?
Well, we already do.
Thoughts or
we already
unhealthy
do.
Thoughts.
We already do. When we think it's something else, we're acting irresponsibly. When we're acting irresponsibly, we suffer anxiety, stress, uncertainty, doubt, reactiveness. We start getting reactive because we're defensive about the thing we're doing because we're not admitting what we're doing. We're not conceding, we're doing it. We're thinking of it as everyone else, everywhere else, and everything else. That's the problem.
Would you say then when it feels good, it's a good thought? And when it feels uncomfortable, it's a bad thought?
Well, the problem, in my estimation, and Alex can probably confirm this, is that addictive thinking thinks heroin is a solution. And it thinks eating more sugar is a solution because it's backward. It's a lie is only based on the idea that it's true. As long as I think something's true that's not true, I am perpetuating a lie. And it only happens in my thoughts. It doesn't have any life anywhere.
Could you say, and I don't have an answer for this, but could you say if you feel as if you need something, that chances are it's an unhealthy thought?
Well, I would say if you need something, you'll never have any doubt. You'll just do it.
But then that's like addiction.
Just like instinct.
But that's like addiction.
Well, only because here's the twist of addiction, which I think Alex can speak to too. Addiction is to think we need the thing that we don't need at all that's killing us. That's the whole point of this twisted, reversed mode of operating. If we think that we can turn a lie into truth, we miss the fact that the only basis of a lie is thinking it's true. That's the only, when a lie is a lie, it's no longer a lie. When wrong is wrong, there's no conflict in it. It's just simply allowed to be what it is. And we can choose whether or not we're going to deal with it in some way that could be productive or deny it and pretend it's not happening and be assured of being unproductive in relation to it and causing bigger problems. And those bigger problems are perfect reflections saying, look, if you don't want to pay attention to this, I'm going to grow as long as it takes to overcome the denial and the defensiveness that you've created to make it apparent to you that there's something you need to do for survival's instinct. Survival tends to override, ultimately, all of the denial and all of the fancy we have with the fascination we create in our own thinking.
You know what this sounds a lot like? Have you guys ever seen Doubt by John Patrick Shanley?
Yeah, that's Hoffman portrayed the priest in that.
With Glenn Close, I think it was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's
Yeah.
The power of a lie, it's or maybe a truth. It's really.
But think of it. There is no power in something that only exists in delusion. But yet we give it those names and think of it in those ways again to give it and imbue it with something it doesn't even have. All those thoughts are held in all those thoughts held in thought are thought to give it credibility that it doesn't have. And I think somebody said earlier, I think it might have been Alex, that ego's looking for credit, constantly looking for credit that's completely unearned because the concept of ego has no credit and has no value and it's an undue concept that it even has any life other than the life we think it has.
It gives itself.
Excuse me?
Other than the life it gives itself. It's like a salesman that basically is trying to sell us on its own value.
Well, but even to think it has this life apart from us is to overlook how cunning we can be in making believe that that thing is apart from us, rather than seeing that we're actually creating that to justify the irresponsibility we want to claim is our plight and that we're victims.
You taught me that. You taught me that about whenever I was saying my addiction, and Jack, I still want to label the bad thoughts from the good thoughts.
Well, we are label makers, my friend.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a good name. You can listen.
Thich Nhat Hanh always talks about that. I don't know if you guys know who he is. He's a really famous Vietnamese Buddhist monk, and he talks about, that especially in the Western culture, we tend to label things in very dualistic ways, good or bad.
Yeah.
Good and evil, hot or cold.
As though they're separate.
Exactly. And then it kind of gets back to this whole idea, Jack, that you were talking about, that we just are.
Yes.
And if we look at, eating, yes, I'm hungry. Is that true? Is it good or bad? I don't know. Is it true? Because I can overeat, and under this, I'm hungry, can, go to the fridge on an unearned time and eat, the next thing that I'm not supposed to, just because I feel I'm hungry.
Well, when we're treating the problem, we're going to look for problems to try to solve the problem. That's what addiction is. I can't ever get enough of something that I'm using to solve the problem when it's not the source of the solution. If I keep using the problem to solve the problem, which is what addiction does, all I continue to do is eat more, look for more, try to get somewhere else, try to not be where I am, and make believe that somehow any of those things are possible. And to your initial point about thinking things dualistically and they can be one and not the other, that whole premise is based on the idea that I can be apart from an infinite absolute source. It's the idea that my source is only what I think. And as a result, I bounce back and forth in the range of thoughts I'm able to tolerate. And when they become intolerable, I start heading in the other direction to give myself a reprieve from that other peril that I'm facing. And I'm constantly on this tennis court playing both parts, running back and forth to retrieve the ball and wonder why I'm exhausted and worn out and feel like life has no value, when it isn't life at all that has no value. It's the ideas I have that I'm expressing that have no value, and I miss the accuracy of my feelings in conceding that they're actually perfect witnesses for what I'm doing in my thinking, rather than what I'm actually experiencing in reality around me. I'm actually just seeing reality as being what I'm thinking it is because I decided I was the creator of reality because I can come to conclusions and believe they're true. It's a big leap that I can't make, If I'm already where I am, I'm always there. I'm always there. We are always there. We are there right now. We cannot be anywhere else. There is no other place because it's not in time or space that present nature is. If something is always new, it has nothing old in it, and it has no time continuum. It's a present state of awareness. We all know that, Everett. Every one of us is aware of that. It's impossible not to be aware of all there is to be aware of if, in fact, we are present, aware beings.
Sounds vaguely like determinism.
Like what?
Determinism.
Yes.
Well, it certainly gives, free will is a form of determinism, and choice is a form of free will. And if we can choose to live a life where we make believe reality and truth and life sucks, that's a pretty free range of will that we've been given to make choices. It actually, if you look at it accurately, begins to be pretty profound that we could live as a complete civilization in this form of denial and delusion and make believe that it's real and think there's no hope, when in fact it's the lack of hope we each have in actually considering ideas that are accurate enough to begin to dispel those rumors, and think that we could ever have any impact on all of it when we're actually contributing to the whole thing by denying it. That isn't a big leap. It is not grandiose to imagine that we're part of something infinite. It's grandiose to imagine that we're not. It's arrogant to imagine we're not, if in fact that thing exists. And I'm not proposing, claiming that it does. I'm simply saying that if we rely on it, just like if we relied on putting one step in front of the other when we were 3 years old or 18 months when we were learning, if we relied on something reliable, it's probably going to work. We're probably going to find it useful. And if we rely on something unreliable, we're probably going to find that things feel out of balance and out of place and disorienting and chaotic and calamitous and things like we don't want, we're not happy with. Those aren't odd confluences of circumstance. They're consequences of our own thinking. There's nothing more primary to our experience than what we think, since it's the director of every choice we ever make, every decision we ever conclude, every action we ever take on a voluntary basis starts with a thought. Every one of them. Everything that's ever been made in the history of civilization, every piece of fruit that's been picked started with a thought. Every seed planted, every row hoed has started with a thought. And if our thoughts twisted, we're going to do things that look like the world is a problem, when in fact we've caused the problem to justify our own irresponsibility in doing those. And yet we wouldn't be claiming irresponsibility if we weren't responsible, which is a pretty sick twist at the other end.
What you said that a thought is the most primary, but what about a feeling?
They're the same. Think about how you describe your feelings. What do you use?
Well, just because we use words and thoughts to describe feelings, that does not mean they're the same.
Well, I would say one is a consequence of the other. And if we don't, I've never known anyone to come out of a coma that said they were depressed.
No, I understand, but I think it's, chicken or the egg. I agree with you that they're, tied together, but they're not the same.
They're simultaneous, though.
Exactly.
They're cause and effect. Cause and effect.
Exactly. Sometimes we can lead our action starting with a feeling that then precipitates into thought, and vice versa.
Oh, but Alex, in seeing that, also notice that the cause can become the effect and the effect becomes the cause, which again reveals the absolute nature of things. The simultaneous nature of something, that cause and effect always can be reversed.
How?
Well, he's describing it. We can have a sensation that leads to a thought. Thoughts don't just happen before sensation. Our primary Geiger counter of the environment is our senses.
Like, for instance,
our senses do not think. They provide raw data of what's happening.
Yeah.
Raw
For instance,
data.
a baby pops out. A baby pops out, I guess I can't argue for the baby, but because, but I
Well,
mean, I don't know if he
God,
thinks
it feels
about.
hungry. It feels
that?
hungry, an emotion, right?
What's that?
The baby pops out, it feels hungry, so that's an emotion. Or it could be, the emotion could be deprivation, right? And then it thinks I want to scream, and then that's a natural reaction.
Is hunger an emotion or a sensation?
Hunger is a sensation, but it's rooted in the emotion of deprivation.
So
Alex-
lacking something.
Yeah.
Like sadness, hostility, anger, whatever.
Fear.
Yeah, fear. Not getting.
Fear is one of the 7 primary emotions.
Alex, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you is that I heard, again, I just heard, it's not my opinion, that a baby doesn't know fear. It's taught fear.
I would disagree with that because we have instinctual drives and fears, right? If we think back to caveman days, we absolutely have fears.
But if a wolf, let's say, like if a wolf came up to a baby that just popped out, it wouldn't necessarily scream.
If it started eating it, it would.
Well, yeah.
Oh, exactly.
So no,
context matters.
Alex, you're making a very important point here that's a real distinction worth noticing. The fear is natural. And if you've ever really experienced fear, you know that it does not function the same way that this self-induced anxiety that we create functions.
Exactly.
Because in one regard, that fear that Alex is describing that's instinctual is a natural guide for survival. And it's an honest guide. It isn't a lie. It's based on a real threat. And what it gives us is instincts to act on that threat and do something about it. Babies cry when they're hungry. They know immediately when they need to have their diapers changed. They seem to be able to get the attention without having any formulation of language. They know what to do to get the attention of adults who can't tell everything that's going on with them. So they communicate in that way. But this other fear, the difference is real fear, time stands still. It doesn't seem like it takes forever. In the fear we induce, it seems to go on forever. Seems to never end, right? Real fear is clarifying. You know exactly what to do, and you do not sit around with your head in your chin saying, I wonder if I should run with this car doing 80 miles an hour that's 30 feet away.
What you're describing, Jack, is a fight or flight response, right?
Yes. Yes.
And we know exactly what that feels like. However, also, let's say in the pandemic, a lot of us got into fight or flight when we were dealing with, the health issue, the health concerns resulting from COVID, and also, the financial aspect of it when so many of us are struggling financially, not knowing what to do.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting.
That's dough, right?
Exactly.
Right. There's fight, flight, or staring in the headlights like fawn. Excuse me. Fawn.
Yes, fawn. So here's what Alex.
Fawn.
In the natural order of things, we were given sensations to guide us through the world. Sort of like a sailor is given tactical equipment to understand the wind, the current, all of the conditions that he's facing at sea. Compasses, all that kind of stuff, right? We have that built into our system. What's interesting about these fight, flight, freeze, and fawn is that a real threat, these help us survive. But listen to how we use them when it's not a real threat, when it's a self-imposed, self-induced, self-created, self-proposed threat in addictive thinking. Fight is denial. All of a sudden, the threat isn't the threat because we can deny it. Flight are compulsions, impulsive reactive behaviors. We try to get away from it. We do everything we can not to feel it. What are we as sentient beings when we become desensitized, unresponsive? What's responsiveness? Signs of life. What's unresponsiveness? A death wish. What's freezing? Generally, if you don't provoke a bear, it's not going to attack. Same with sharks very often. They'll basically just continue to swim. What do? Go numb. Think what's happening isn't happening. All of a sudden, we become completely desensitized and we think we're safe because we're calloused and cold to what's going on, when in fact, both of those conditions would reference someone post-death, post-mortem. Their body would be cold. We try to act cool. It's not a good direction for humans that are running at 98.6 degrees. And fawn is effectively enabling. We're going to make nice. We're going to think that if we treat the problem nicely and we cozy up to it and we become its friend, somehow it will get better. And what are we doing? Nourishing it. Think of what we do with others when we give them cash and they go and get drugs and end up overdosing on the money we gave them to get food. When we think giving more latitude to somebody who clearly doesn't have the capacity to make good enough decisions to be anywhere other than in the face of great peril, and we think as a society, the best thing we can do is give them more latitude. And what do we have? Addiction overdoses higher than we've ever had on our streets in Los Angeles. I don't know how it is elsewhere, but I imagine this runs pretty consistent throughout human civilization. And what's interesting is those decisions made by people, as Laura Alice was mentioning, those people making those decisions are addicted to ideas that don't work, and then using the growing problem to justify more of the ideas they think do work, which is to build $1 million condos right now for people. That's the solution. That's like saying that because our public transit system is successful, we should start buying everyone who takes it a car. It would make no sense to create a public transit system that's successful because it's efficient and gets people going where they need to go, and all of a sudden give them all cars. We're not addressing the problem accurately because we're not thinking about it accurately.
What kind of cars?
Teslas.
Right on time.
Perfect Anthony setup.
On time. He
And-
has
and
arrived.
You know what's interesting? You know what charges the electric cars?
Coal.
Oh, coal, yes. You know what coal is? Carbon. It's one of the major producers of global warming. Those little bits of carbon in the atmosphere are what landed in the snow that ended up being overheated by the sun that started the melt of all the snow caps and all the things around the world. It's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. It's a consequence of what we're doing. Our thinking is going to continue to lead in directions where the ideas seem great and everybody buys in, but they'll end up creating the next major problem. And one of those problems is now stripping the earth of the products needed for this growing industry.
Yeah.
That isn't a clean industry in that regard. It's not honest to think of it that way.
No.
We
Can
like
we work on-
deception when we're in denial.
Can we work on somebody's specific obsession?
It's all the same, Anthony.
How about yours, Anthony? That sounds like
Well,
volunteering.
That's what I want to go, but I don't.
That's his indirect way to pull the attention on him.
You were just voluntold, Anthony.
Voluntold.
I can't really think of one at this moment because everything's so perfect. But I'm sure that's why I need
But
somebody else.
Anthony, that's a good place to start, right there.
I'm trying to find one.
Yeah, I know. So the fact that you can't, given your normal propensity to having 6 or 8 in tow in your holster, ready to pull out so that you can focus on each individually as though they're separate. You know what I've learned when people start to say, I don't know what to say? They're starting to actually consider what's happening in ways they've never considered. So their mouth isn't yapping as a result of their thoughts chasing a way to get out. They're just beginning to listen and learn and grow and notice. And you just said it. Everything's perfect. That's a very different viewpoint.
But is it really?
Well,
that's what I'm going to do. But is it really perfect?
You have the absolute choice to make any mess you want. And I would consider, if you would, that every choice you've ever made to make a mess was a choice that you made freely, that you wanted. And if you wanted it, think of how sick it is to want something that hurts us, and how it must be coming from a source of thinking that is sick to begin with. to think that the best thing we can do is distract ourselves with problems that keep our focus off of the actual problem by claiming the problems in all of their little itsy bitsy ways are the problem rather than the problem sourced in the thinking we're doing.
Yeah. Or once this happens, I'll stop.
Yeah. And when it does, it's never enough because you're not treating the problem, you're treating the symptom. One of the natural aspects of addiction is that we treat the feeling, which is a symptom of the thinking. Going back to, Alex, what we were talking about. The feeling is a generalized sensation about the thinking we're doing. And if my thinking is wrong, my feeling's going to be bad, wrong, uncertain, and all those things. And Everett, to your point earlier, if I'm witnessing feeling bad and I'm thinking what I need to do is feel better, I'm contributing to the addiction of that thought by not noticing that the bad that I'm feeling is an accurate assessment of the thinking I'm doing that's bad. And when I start to line those things up, bam, all of a sudden the whole thing goes. And the charge is the weight we bear, the depression we built. The depression is the resistance we have. It's the oppression that we create to what we're doing. We're oppressing. We're making believe reality and truth isn't there, and all that's true is and real is what we're thinking.
So, in other words, when I'm feeling depressed, it's an accurate assessment of my sick thinking.
Yes. Yes. So if you sit with that, what's that, Alex?
There's truth to that, and what you were just saying, Jack, that I really enjoyed listening to is the fact that our emotions are data just like our thoughts, right? So It's just telling us something. And just a few minutes ago, we were all discussing the fight or flight reaction, and it happens because of a real threat. So our emotions are necessary because of that to make us, to protect us. However,
interesting though.
However, the way we deal with our emotions is if our solution is only to feel better at all costs without feeling that emotion of maybe sadness or whatever other negative or uncomfortable emotion is, then we're not allowing ourselves the opportunity to feel that emotion
and to grow.
Well, we're actually allowing ourselves the opportunity, but we're denying the source of it by making believe that what it tells us to do is run like hell.
Right.
So, Alex, the other issue, I lost the point. You were right on the verge of it, and I wanted to add a little bit to that. My senses, been my experience, that my senses don't have opinions, they just convey information.
Right.
And when I create a threat, which I'm literally creating in my own obsessive thinking, it's a death wish. And I'm asking to start thinking in ways that will only do things that kill me. Compulsions never, ever attach to anything that's healthy, ever.
Exactly. And I think what's important here to discuss is that every compulsion starts with a truth, with a true emotion or something that is real, and then it just starts to spiral, and when we add all of these other layers.
But my suspicion is, Alex, when we start thinking about things that are scary and have fear and take that fear as being real, like instinctual fear, we mistake the fear for something that is real and true rather than something that's a concoction of delusion. So our emotions now start reacting to something that isn't even happening. And I would say that all the things that we would normally use in favor of good judgment are used to make bad judgment. And we feel victims to them because we've chosen to act on these thoughts that aren't true and real and make believe that they are. My suspicion is my emotions don't have the same quantitative capacity my brain does for coming up with rationalizations. They simply reflect what I'm doing. And if what I'm doing is wrong, I feel it. I know it. I know it. Yeah. So there's an element there. My sense is things are truthful. They're very, very simple because there is no variation amongst all the different ways to look at it. They become very simple because the underlying premise of truth doesn't change. It isn't something that's violable or divisible or inequitable or distinct. It's universal, and even the universe would be small in relation to the concept of something infinite.
Yeah. And I'm kind of going back to those, instinctual emotions that we were talking about. When we're really facing, like a truck coming at us or something, or a real threat, there's no time to think. There's no time to. all we can do is react.
Think of that, though, Alex. Think of even the term. There's no time to think. Interesting.
Right. Exactly.
That knowing
That's
doesn't
what you were
function.
describing, the difference between instinctual emotions or that whole process.
But also intuition.
A response.
A sense of knowing that isn't bound by time or space. It's an ever-present state of clarity that we're always in. It's an ever-present meditative state of awareness that we're always in. And it's a very interesting choice of words. You have no time, because there is no time in that present.
Exactly.
If there's no beginning, or if there's no end, and it's only ever beginning anew, there is no time continuum. It's literally the presence of the presence is present. And it's the basis of our complete existence. If I make believe that I'm disconnected from it, or can be, that's a bad start to a line of reasoning.
And what you're describing, I mean, if you ask somebody who, just, averted getting hit by a car, or, something really intense and traumatic, and they just jumped out of harm's way, what they would tell you is that they experienced being in the moment, that nothing else existed.
Yes.
Yeah. And
so here's my question. Isn't it interesting that we only seem to experience that when our life is at risk? And why is it?
Mm-hmm.
We must be living in a state of putting ourselves at risk without thinking we are most of the other time, to only rely on instances that allow that revelation to be clear, because of our constant preoccupation of obstruction that we're doing, in a preoccupation of thought that is chronically spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning, that we're paying all our attention to. Does that sit, Alex?
Yeah. I mean, and somebody just mentioned in the chat that it's like fighting. I mean, I don't know if anybody has been in a fight, but when that adrenaline kicks in, it's like you're right here, right now. The only thing that's happening is the current moment.
Well, and I would say the current moment is always happening. It can't, we can't chase it away unless we literally think thoughts and our thoughts are real and true. But our experience changes dramatically by what we're thinking. And to overlook this is to think the edges of our thoughts, like the mariners of old did, are the edge of doom, rather than to begin to see that those limited ideas that we maintain are the beginning of everything else, not the end of anything.
Jack, I think also that if we really, really like analyze, when we're faced with something that is, let's say, scary or super dangerous, there is like, or every time I've been faced with something that's been really like epically dangerous, the fear didn't kick in until a beat afterwards, when I actually almost intellectualized what was really happening. It was almost like all of a sudden that credible threat is right there in your face, like right there. And you're like, okay. And then the fear kicked in.
You know the Shakespeare, the Shakespeare, you do, Everett. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Yeah.
My sense is that he was referring to thoughts. Foolish thoughts rush in.
It's like
where angels fear to tread, which is you're now thinking about what's happening rather than actually being with what's happening, and you've let your brain make believe. Now, I would suggest that when your nature is trying to be overcome by thinking, that would be an over-reliance on thought, when in fact your knowing awareness is the least at risk, but your thinking awareness puts that knowing awareness at greater risk, because once you start thinking, you're going to take time to come to a conclusion that's not going to help.
Exactly. It's like the truck.
You can see that interface.
Yeah, it's like the truck, when the truck is barreling at you and it's 6 feet away, there ain't nothing you can do. And it's one of those, okay.
No, there's everything you can do. You could stand still. You could pretend you couldn't do anything. You could think it's 100 feet away. You could do all those things. I mean, part of the problem is we start to think things aren't possible that are absolutely possible.
I guess what I'm trying to say is when you don't have time to think,
you know.
Yeah. And there's a
Yes.
certain peace in that.
Yes, there's absolute peace in it because peace is the nature of knowing.
Yeah.
And peace is the nature of truth and reality. And peace is the nature of stability because it can't be unstable. So that clarity is our present state of knowing. And isn't it interesting that we wait till we have near-death experiences to experience it? Imagine how buried we become as a civilization of species, to make believe that what's happening isn't that present moment when it's always been all that's ever been happening, and everything that's been happening has been connected to every moment we've ever spent. If we had it, if it could even be spent, as though someday we could run out of that spending. If it's infinite, there is no way to expend that. And yet we take the comforts of our own luxuriation and our own thinking about thinking and thinking about ourselves as being disconnected from that and wonder why we struggle with disorders. It is not a secret. It's not an accident. It's not a curse. It's a self-induced state that we as a culture, if we're healthy at all, offer everyone else who may be worse off than we are right now a greater potential to get better if we choose to do what we can about what we're doing and make way rather than continue to infect the grid with more reactive behaviors that keep people further on guard and more defensive and more reactive.
I wonder if our struggle as humans is that thinking, that knowing that we're going to die and the thinking about it.
No, you know what we're really afraid of, Everett? Not death. We're afraid of life. And you know why? Because it would dispel every lie that we're maintaining that we call who we are. And what we're afraid of is not thinking about those lies. Why? Because those lies all are based on fear. And we have grown and developed a manner of living that suggests our maintenance of that fear is how you control life. And life has no control. Life has no beginning or end. Life doesn't die. And we don't die as beings. What dies is this body that tells stories, and it too has the same arc of a story, a beginning, middle, and end. And my suspicion is nobody's ever been afraid to die enough to prevent having died. But people have died earlier than they otherwise would have been from the fear about thinking about something that isn't happening, while in fact they're actually nursing the thoughts that are killing them in the present. And I would say that's the difference between mental health and unhealthy mental state. And our capacity to undermine our body's ability to function is extraordinarily good to have had genes adapt to this misunderstanding of thought and deal with the stress and come up with trying to figure out how to deal with something that doesn't even exist, because our genes actually change over generations. They adapt to what's happening around us. And subjecting our bodies to the anxiety that we do have had our bodies create more and more allergies to things that they just can't handle, that it might otherwise in good health well be able to handle.
This is why I feel like, sports is a really good analogy and why we love sports. Watching basketball, and the threat of one team, threatening the other and playing offense and defense in that moment. This is what we call, that zone that we were just talking about. When that athlete, whether it's LeBron or whoever, is basically has to make the quickest decision possible based on, everything that's happening. What actually is going on in most athletes' brains is that, they are in that zone and they actually avert thinking as much as possible. They rely on muscle memory, and then a lot of aspects of their game becomes instinctual.
Yes.
Reality.
This is why we call it having smart feet.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think also that's an addiction to reality TV, although it's not really reality because they mess around with drama.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, I'm literally specifically talking about, like a single play or whatever it is, that heroic piece. I'm not talking about the narratives of the drama of
right.
everything else.
Like Michael Jordan's that like half court shot that won the game.
So you're talking about intuition and knowing.
Exactly.
And that's our design.
That's why I brought it up. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. And that's the premise of our existence. It isn't something that's negotiable. It isn't something that's debatable, though we can debate it. It doesn't change it. It stays the same. And if that's the case, that's what we have right now, where we are, where we're sitting, each of us and everyone else too, everywhere else, no matter what we think. And it starts to put thinking in its place as something humans do, not something we are, not something our life depends on, but to its ability to function on our behalf to help us rather than be used to undermine our potential and kill us.
Yeah.
Suicide's at an all-time high today. It's not an accident. It's a consequence of not dealing with this problem in thought. Addiction's at an all-time high. Countries are being overrun by drug dealers and blamed for the problem while the countries consuming the most amount of the drugs being developed and imported aren't talking about the drug problem they're having, and that would be a good example of our country. This isn't an accident. People are searching to put themselves out of the misery being created in their thinking, and thinking the best thing they can do is alter their body, and they're dying at an all-time rate. They're trying to alter their experience rather than recognize that the experience is being altered by the thinking they're doing, and there is a primary issue at play there that if any of us get better at not doing, everyone gets a better chance at beginning to see with a little more perspective their own part in doing it. So this isn't a plea. It's not a demand. It's not a cause. It's a simple acknowledgement that if we're doing it and we're making the mess, we're doing it. And it's each of us that plays a role in that part. And to any degree I don't talk about it honestly and openly, I become complicit in the consequences that occur. Absolutely, in all respects, I'm responsible. If I don't do what I can do, and what I can do is bury my head, I am playing the role of pretending the problem has nothing to do with me, when in fact the reason I'm burying my head is because I feel so ashamed that I would ever take that position, having been given that intuitive knowing sense that's much greater than what I've ever thought and ever will think until I allow my thinking to follow that sense and start acting on the basis of that knowing and say and do things that I couldn't have otherwise ever expected within the confines of the limited thinking I was perpetuating. And I would say that's true for all of us. That's what we're here to do, is express it.
And that we would rather take the easy way because obviously drugs...
Because it's the hardest way.
Make you feel amazing within the shortest amount of time. Who wants to sit there and contemplate their thoughts?
Well, I think we've gotten so used to thinking it's natural to call the hard way the easy way, but in fact, the hard way is
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. It's kind of led us to exactly the impossibility that people feel today. How could something possible be impossible if not for the thinking that's impossible about it? What's happening is no accident. It's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence, but even the word coincidence is interesting if you think of it as a coincidence. It's happening simultaneously, like feeling and thought. Whatever we're thinking now, however limited we are thinking, however obsessed we are with thoughts we think are true and real, is having an impact on the entire grid of all thinking. And it actually impresses cells. We make impressions on cells, and the longer we maintain those impressions are only weights that wouldn't otherwise occur except in our thoughts, the opposition. The longer we maintain them, the more prone we are to depression. The present moment is accumulation of everything that's ever happened right now. There's no past to go back to that isn't present in its effect right now. And to think any less than what's happening is to think what's happening isn't happening. And that's a pretty big stretch when everything that's happening is happening. So our discussion is about that. And beginning to actually collectively, as a small group, speak in those terms, to look at it accurately and begin contemplating in those terms. And I guarantee you, as you do, things will begin to occur to you that you would have thought impossible within the confines of your limited thoughts, and begin to realize that thing has always been there and available. And you've just been busy denying and opposing and making believe that your defensive behavior was who you are. And that's a pretty sick idea, to think we are limited by these defenses that we create to make believe the self we think we are is all we are, and then wonder why we feel less than and alone and separate, when in fact that's a perfect definition of the thoughts we're having about who we actually are. Knowing better, ultimately, than to think who we think we are is who we are. We choose roles to play. That's all they are, just like athletes do. There's no offense that can be taken if you don't have a defense, and there is no game played where offense and defense don't occur naturally. Which, to your point, Alex, I think helps see that it's the challenge of meeting those defensive postures with a good offense, and a good defense or a good offense with a good defense. They're simultaneous. They're interactive. They're part of the whole. They're not separate. You've never had a great football team that was only offensive and only played teams with offenses. It would be irrelevant. They just have 2 minutes to throw the ball and get touchdowns, and it would be who can run the fastest and who can throw the furthest. So that's life, is that dynamic. Life is the totality of both ends of that spectrum. And the freedom of noticing that they are held, both extremes are always held by common ground. And the common ground is held by all of us. And the positions of one or the other are decisions we make, choices we make, stakes in the ground we place as though they're real and true based on what we decide to do. No more. There is no real stake in error. Try to put stake in error. There's nothing there. It's all a concoction of thought. All of those struggles, all of those demands, all of those extremes, all of the New Year's resolutions are all attempting to overcome something that we clearly haven't done for a year, and all of a sudden think we're going to muster the willpower to overcome the same resistance it took a year to get us to a point to think we're going to resolve to all of a sudden do it now. Never happens. It just becomes a new mark in the belt of failure, to justify our own inadequacy and our own inability. But we're trying to do what's impossible, so why wouldn't it fail? It fails naturally, and that's a good sign. Same as doing something that works. It's really good to learn how something works, because you can always utilize it. You can always use it. You can always produce based on it. You don't have to go back and go through the whole learning curve. And if we already have a great sense of knowledge and ignore that, then the premise for our knowledge is coming from a lack of knowledge, and constantly has us squandering the time we use trying to get somewhere we actually have always been. And again, that's a pretty sick concept. If we're there and denying it and making believe we're not there, and then acting out in every other way to get there, it means no matter what we do, we'll always end up in places that never feel right, because we never got used to the idea that where we are is already right, and where we are is now the only place we can possibly be. And we're there currently. Even the word current is interesting. It means now and a flow, a current.
For a raisin.
What's that?
For a raisin.
Is that a current?
Then there is a form of raisin called current.
Yeah.
I think there's an A in there after the second R, which leads to ant.
Antony?
Uh-oh.
So if an absolute nature is absolute, there's no argument in it. There's no contest in it. There's no doubt in it, because there is no question of it or in it. The only questions of it come from thought. And if we can consume ourselves with that thought and make believe that that's truth and reality, it's certainly an option we have. It's one we are free to make. And we are also as free to suffer the consequences that come with it. And those consequences are perfectly designed to get our attention, because our body knows when there's an emergency. And when we start thinking that a lie is real, it knows there's emergency afoot, because the decisions we're going to start making have already started to undermine the body's ability to face what's actually happening in any meaningful way.
Now we talk about problems.
The problem is never a problem until we notice the problem we're creating of the problem. And when we see that problem without the thinking we do that makes it a problem, we will see it as something that can be dealt with, or something that doesn't need any dealing. It's just a construct of thought. To be thinking it's not what we want it to be. That's generally all problems are, is things that we think aren't the way we want them to be. If you just look at them as what they are, that's not a problem. They're just what they are. And choosing to engage is a choice.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then we could start that whole discussion about when you think you have a problem, that's really not even your biggest problem, probably, because you're working on it. At least you know of it. You have a problem that you're not even aware of, probably, that's even bigger.
Well, the whole concept of thinking we're not thinking what we're thinking, and yet we talk about having a subconscious, is kind of odd to even think about our subconscious and then talk about thinking we're not thinking what we're thinking. We're admitting we know that there's a part of us that seems to think outside of you, and then talk about it as something that we're not doing. Well, that's in my subconscious. I can't be, if it's in there, it's just in the dark. And it's like a ghost that we think may be there because we haven't turned on the light. Part of what I learned at one point is that what I called my subconscious is where I kept every thought I wanted to maintain a responsibility for. And if I'm basically, my basis is responsible, because there's a responsible source in this universe, my human experience in this universe that I'm given to act out in, or act up in, or whatever I do with my actions and behavior. If that's what I've given and it's responsible for me being able to do that, then the basis of my experience is responsibility. The basis of my existence is responsibility. And if there's anything true, it would be true for all, not for some. Not because some people take it or not. You can't take responsibility if it's the nature of your existence, any more than our eye needs to understand what it's doing to see what it sees. It just is designed that way. It does what it's doing, and it does what it does, and doesn't even need to see itself. And as a matter of fact, our eyes are one thing it can never see, and yet it sees. And we don't struggle with the fact that we can't see our own eye. And whenever we see it, we're only seeing it as an image. And that image, by the way, is always reversed. So this image of self is a reversal of who we actually are based on thought. And it isn't even a reversal, because it's just basically a concept in thought, which is nothing more than an idea. The reversal is the thought that it could be real and true. The imagination of it is something that's possible for us to do. It's just an action we can take.
I love this. There was a thing on TikTok not that long ago where it would invert your face. So instead of seeing yourself the way you do in the mirror, you would see yourself the way everyone else saw you.
Right.
And it literally brought people to tears. They were so upset about it because that's not how they saw themselves, but clearly that's how the world sees them. And that simple thing, I mean, it was just, people had such big emotions over that. It was fantastic to watch.
Well, and think, LA, in relation to how we communicate. and how much we struggle to have people see our point. Right?
Absolutely. Our point of view, which is inverted anyway.
And feel missed. Yeah, well, if it's inverted, if what we're telling is a story about who we think we are and all of the problems and woes we see as a result of that thinking, and then think all we're going to trigger in other people is what they think. And generally speaking, all people are doing is waiting for us to finish so they can start telling us their story that nobody ever listens to. And what do people say? You don't get me. You don't see me for who I am. What we don't see is the thoughts people have about who they think they are. That's not who they are. If what we have is something we all share in any way that is infinite, which would be every way, then it isn't something that's different between us. It's something we absolutely share in exactly the same way. So to speak in terms of difference is to speak in terms of choice and will. And choice is will to the human. Our will is what we choose. And self-will is the idea that what we think is who we are. And so what we do defines us in thought. It doesn't actually, but people say, I'm a doctor. Well, actually, they've just got a degree in doctorhood. They don't become doctors. They still stay the essence of who they are with an academic prowess that not everyone shares. So those are things people do. They're not things they become, though we talk in those terms because we think of ourselves as what we do, because we think of ourselves in terms of what we think. And doing is a function of thought. And thought is a function of doing, by the way. The primary action we take is in thought, which leads to every other action that's voluntary. Except when there's no time to think. I love that term that Alex used. So I always note the calm when it descends, and my suspicion is, if I need to be a suspect in this process, that contemplation, consideration, when it starts occurring, exposes less of a knee-jerk reaction or interaction and becomes contemplative and meditative and aware of something that is certainly profound compared to feeling that we need to find or seek to find something. Profound is for finding. It's for being. It's for, like, forgiveness. It's about having things the way they are. The only things I don't forgive are the thoughts I have about things that aren't the way they are. I don't not forgive other people. It's my thinking about them that is unforgivable to me because I'm not having them as they are. What am I giving them? A lack of forgiveness. I'm not having them as they are, so I think I'm taking from them what they are. And then that's all I have to give them, which is a conflict. So silence, as somebody said earlier, is the nature of peace. There is, I think Everett was on that edge. It's really the nature of our awareness. It's not spoken. Speaking is all a function of thought. It's an action, something we do. And the suggestion in here to watch your thoughts isn't a suggestion to censor what you're thinking any more than watching your words is a suggestion to mention what you're saying. But it's simply to notice that as an observer of those things, thinking and words and feelings, if we begin observing them and hearing what we're saying, you'll start seeing that a lot of what you're saying isn't what you mean at all, that the connotation of it is very different than the thing you say. And one of the common words is because. Because is an excuse, but in fact, if you break the word down, it's be cause. Just be cause. If we're causing something, that's what we're causing. So because is using it as an excuse. Because always precedes an excuse, justification, rationalization. some form of assignment other than I'm cause of that thing I thought and that thing I did. Doesn't mean it's who I am. It just means it's something I did, something I thought of. So it's something I acted on. And addiction is a reaction to the action. If the action is repulsive, the reaction is almost guaranteed. And to notice that, as Everett was asking earlier, how do you define these thoughts? You notice the disruption. You notice the lack of silence. You notice the clamor, the voices, the arguments, the disruption in your thinking. And those things, anxiety, stress, etc., are in fact indicators that we know better. We wouldn't have those sensations if we didn't know better. They're all indications that we have a very clear awareness of what's going on, and whether we pay attention to those thoughts, like we were talking about, the backward nature of acting on addictive thoughts has us use the instinctive drives to actually kill ourselves, to actually do the exact thing that puts us at risk, rather than the thing instincts are designed to do by resolving risks and solving problems that put us at risk.
Does anybody have any problems we can work on?
You know, when you think about it, yeah, you, Anthony.
Hey, did Sturgis have the baby? His wife?
Yes. Lady Francis.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank
That's
you.
huge. Making it look easy, buddy.
Congratulations.
I
How has it
don't know
been so
who's
far?
looking, but yeah. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
How old is too young to be on this Zoom call? When is she going to be on this Zoom call?
She's on it.
She's on it right now. Yeah.
Perfect. You'd never be too young.
No parent of a 2-week-old is far away.
And as far as those
That's
babies,
right.
babies sensing fear, you know, they did those psychology experiments where they have the glass tabletop, or to see if it keeps crawling over the edge of the table or not, if it understands that there's something to be afraid of. I don't remember what happened.
I mean, I haven't done the test, if that's what you're asking.
But I know noise scares little kids, right? So they definitely have those built-in self-defense mechanisms.
Well,
I remember that experiment. You know, they did a glass table or a glass top, and then they had a pattern on it. And the children, the babies who were crawling, they would crawl only to the point of the pattern. They wouldn't crawl past the pattern. They instinctively knew that felt like an visual edge to them, so they didn't want to cross it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that tracks. I mean, she is incredibly sensitive and aware, and like knows exactly what's going on. And I think, would I mean, she's naturally she's naturally sort of, her senses are so sharp right now, because she hasn't had any, she hasn't had years of attempting to dull them like me. So, she's really, that doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest, so far at least. She seems more willing to react to the things that are happening to her in real time than I am most of the time.
Like not enough food.
Yeah, not enough food, feeling gassy, mad that you have the light on because it's bothering her. Like, these things are
clear senses of awareness.
Yeah, and she immediately lets you know without any hesitation about what you think about her, letting her know that is imagined in your head. Are you?
So if that awareness is our natural state, and we would still naturally be aware, identifying individual problems and thinking the solution is trying to modify the problems we're having rather than look at the source of those problems from a mental state and one that we cause them from will keep us in a loop of trying and trying and trying and trying and never achieving a solution. Doesn't mean we can't modify, doesn't mean we can't manage, doesn't mean we can't think we're controlling it. But what we're doing is basically just moderating the problem by thinking of it on a scale that's tipping back and forth according to where we put our attention, place our attention and tend to it, and think that maintaining that all the time now to maintain that balance is a natural state, which is distracting to the essence of that greater knowing awareness within thinking. Because now we're subjecting thinking to 1,000 different jobs it's got to do all day long to maintain, rather than start seeing that none of those balancing acts are anything more than a vain hope thinking's going to solve the problem, and not recognize that the balance is imbalanced based on a stability, like every teeter-totter is based on a stable platform. Our platform is that knowing knowledge. Our problems are choices we make. The problem is seldom the problem until we see the way we're thinking about it as being the problem. How we see things tend to be the problem. There's very few other problems. We talked about those other problems earlier as being instinctive, and we know exactly what to do when they occur. So real problems, when they occur, we know exactly what to do. These other problems that we doubt and struggle with are clearly induced by a form of thinking that we really haven't come to terms with. And it isn't to suggest that we can't have the doubt. Whenever we take on a challenge, decide to, if you want to grow apples, it's going to take some learning. It's going to take some failure. It's going to take some experience. It's going to take some not feeling great about what you did. But to consider those feelings as anything other than what you're thinking in relation to what you're doing is to miss the basis of how we operate as humans, and start thinking about it only in terms of consequence and what we like about it and don't like about it and woe is me. And now you got a real problem. And those are the problems that we're talking about in here. It's not the one and the other and the individual thing. It's looking at the root of it and starting to see that we're complicitous in all of them, including each other's, to any degree that we make believe that we're separate from the whole, separate from the herd, alone, can be separate, need to function on a way that keeps us apart from everybody and isolates ourselves and insulates ourselves and all that stuff. Those are not directions that are healthy. They're possible, and we're welcome to them. But ultimately, they're all attempts to make believe that we can do what's impossible, and will always take effort that will wear us out at some point and show the failure of it in some way we claim not to expect, when in fact we created we set it up to happen, to show us exactly the weakness of the thinking we're doing to get to that point that finally gets our attention to look at it accurately rather than continue to manage it inaccurately and think our job is constantly thinking about things that are wrong, trying to believe someday they'll be right. It isn't honest to be dishonest and not to see things as they are and not to begin to talk about them in terms that are accurate. And it's not kind to tell other people everything will be okay when you're actually inducing them into a repetition of behaviors you can clearly see are not working. And it isn't a matter of telling other people what's wrong with them, but starting to admit the wrong in us that gives them a chance to start to notice that if I'm doing it and we share everything, they might have a better chance of noticing what they're doing in a constructive manner, rather than me thinking I need to stop them from doing something that irritates me and start to notice it's my own thoughts I'm irritated with, not theirs. Which I would say is a good definition of unity and union and communion and community. So silence, I would say, is a good departure point. Except for my own interruption.
You all are awesome. I appreciate being here with you today.
Thank you, LA, very much. It's good to hear you and see you.
Thanks, LA.
Thank you guys. Have a great day.
You know, ultimately, peace is love, and love, if it's an absolute source, is always giving. It's always given. It is always a natural state of our being. It is the source of everything. And we can think of it any way we want, but it doesn't mean it will change. And the longer we think of it in the way we think, we're thinking in self-centered ways that create problems, that give us the impression that the world is a problem and that the universe is a problem, that God or whatever that infinite source is a problem, when in fact it's the simple thing we're doing. Like getting a piece of sand stuck in our eye would make seeing difficult. It's the same thing with these thoughts, making believe that everything else becomes difficult when the difficulty of my thinking is the source of that thought. So with that, I thank you guys. I love you guys. I appreciate that we're able to do this together.
Yeah.
Ty, good to
Aloha,
see
we
you.
love you. We're
Good to see
showing
you in
you.
town.
Thank you.
Whoa.
Yeah, the view looks pretty good of the ocean from Hawaii.
Beautiful day. I'm going to go set up on Hana Highway and hawk canthas and beads like an old
Wow.
hippie. It's fun.
That's great. Enjoy it. Love you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Aloha, love
Bye,
you.
everybody.
That was great.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome.